Thank you. In addition to law and lifelong interest in Russia and Eurasia, I worked for 8 years as a public opinion researcher. And I think this issue that is symbolized by what we call Saltanat's law, but it's not just about Saltanat's law. It is about essentially the soul of Kazakhstan and about modernization. Traditional societies, be it Islamic, Christian, Orthodox Jewish, or others, have a very hierarchical structure in which women are relegated to a secondary position. Modernistic societies have equality of gender and equality of rights. Just before I came online now, I looked up one of the regional neighbors of Kazakhstan, Iran. I did a lot of looking at Russia, but Iran is an extreme case because in the civil act or civil law of Iran that regulates relationships in the family, women are defined as the property of the husband. Not in Sharia, not in religious law, in civil law. And the terms are property and maintenance. So the husband has a right. The husband is explicitly the head of the family. I wouldn't mind if the law, no, I'm just kidding. The husband is a head of the family, and he has a duty to maintain the wife, like you maintain property. But if the wife does not perform her duties, as the very interesting conversation that Jennifer quoted between a mother and their two daughters, and the daughter says, "You're the wife." She said, "No, I'm doing all the hard work. I'm the husband." So if the wife doesn't perform the duties, the husband is exempt of the maintenance duty under the law. And that is an extreme case, of course. Now, let's move on to Russia. Russia decriminalized violence in the family, not just against women, also against children. So if a parent beats up a child or psychologically and systematically abuses a child, there's a fine if it's proven in court. And then oftentimes the NGOs that are dealing with this issue in Russia would report that a fine triggers more violence. So if a woman complains of abuse, police gets involved, writes a fine to the husband, or he goes to some low-level administrative court. The court finds the husband. That escalates the violence. I also found a lot of reporting or commentary, including from lawyers in Russia, criticizing what they call the Western approaches to family law and juvenile justice. They say, well, you know, it was pioneered in America, this horrible, as the Russians call it, Anglo-Saxon country. Then it was copied in France. But look, you know, they're taking kids away from, you know, abusive families and abusive circumstances. This is not the way to do it. This is against Russian skripy, Russian traditional ties of the families. This is not our way. And as early as 2012, there are demonstrations with thousands of people. 2,000 people came out for a demonstration against juvenile justice in Moscow, probably urged by the Russian Orthodox Church. And the church is also was a significant factor in decriminalizing violence against women. So what happened? As Kazakhstan for decades and centuries was paying a lot of attention to what's going on with the big northern neighbor in 2017, they also decriminalized the violence against women. And the statistics that I looked at demonstrated decline of reported violence. Well, if it's not a crime, why bother and report it, right? Less work for the police, less work for the courts. However, I found different reports of how many women die of family violence in Kazakhstan. The lowest figure is about 80 a year. That's 80 too many. And higher numbers that I saw is 400 a year. Now, in the US, to compare, Kazakhstan is 16 and a half times smaller than the US, 20 million versus 330 million. So I did the calculations, and probably we in the US have better reporting numbers. And also the category is family deaths from family violence, women and children. In the US, in Kazakhstan, if you take the 80,000 number, little calculations here, 80 a year, in the US times 16 and a half, it would be translated 1,300 and something. If you take a higher number, 400, it would be translated 4,000, no, probably more than that, in low thousands. The reported US number that I found is 48,000 women and children killed in the families a year. This is comparable with traffic accidents, so this comparable with fentanyl abuse and drug abuse, medical malpractice, which is 45,000. So this is a huge factor in the US, and we are much more urbanized, much less traditional society, atomized society than a country like Kazakhstan. There are other aspects that you could argue that this is violence. I'm not an authority or an expert on family practices in that part of the world, but what I found in literature are reports on bride kidnapping in Kyrgyzstan in particular, but you hear these stories in other places, Southern Caucasus included. So this notion of a woman as chattel, as property, is a toxic notion. And recognizing the urbanization, recognizing modernization, trying to move Kazakhstan towards OECD membership and norms. President Tokayev in 2022 returned the Constitutional Court, and in 2023 was acutely aware that the society is not happy with violence against women. And I think that the case of the horrible end of Saltanat was a trigger, was a catalyst to move towards a change in legislation, criminalization of family violence, and towards recriminalizing it. And also from the public opinion point of view, now putting my public opinion researcher hat, the demand in the society for a change in this younger, more urbanized, less observant society, that demand made total political sense internally and externally. So internally, younger demographics would be more supportive, men and women, more urban people, more educated people, more in the elite, despite the fact that Saltanat and her abusive husband were a part of the elite. The elites understand, they travel, they read, they get educated abroad. They understand that to abuse women and children, to kill a wife, is a taboo now in a modern Westernized society. This is not done. This should not be tolerated. We are, I think, in a transitional period. In that law, the activist groups, women's groups, human rights groups pointed out that it didn't put family violence in a separate criminal category. Why is it important? It's important because a situation of abuse in a family is different than, let's say, you were on a soccer team and your teammate punched you out in the face. You can go away. If you complain, there are no day-to-day consequences. Whereas in the family, if you complain, you are trapped in a way in a toxic situation. So the question mark is there going to be a recognition, like we have in the West, of family violence as a separate category? What is the meaning of this clear signal that Kazakhstan, together with other members of what was known as a sort of pro-Western group in the former Soviet Union, Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, and now Kazakhstan, criminalize family violence, whereas more pro-Russian country like Belarus decriminalized it, as did Russia. This is the part where we're talking about how to perceive it in sort of foreign and international context as opposed to domestic context, as I mentioned. Another example, if domestic violence is not criminalized, women, who are the vast majority of abuse victims, sometimes it's men too, but mostly women, when they go to receive medical care, I have a report here, the author said, a woman comes to a clinic and says, oh, I slipped and fell, and the doctor goes, and treats the injury as if it was a non-violent trauma. Detour the police. Oh, it's not criminalized. It's not our business. So I found it fascinating that the Russian influence played a role in original decriminalization in 2017. Now, both politically and internationally, it's recognized. The fact is, we are having this discussion in Washington about an internal Kazakh issue. I think it's a strong signal for women and girls inside Kazakhstan that their rights are recognized. The government, what was the expression there? The government that hears. Remember when President Tokayev came, the listening government?
Listening government.
Yes, in a good sense, listening government. So the government hears and sees these women and these issues. I think that there are reports that among younger people, Islamic observance does not necessarily clash with the value of women's rights, whereas in more traditional, more orthodox, more strict Islamic tradition, some level of violence towards women and general restriction on women's rights. For example, in Saudi, until very recently, women could not travel without a male companion, and this is still the case in Iran. So, of course, nothing like that happens in Kazakhstan, which is not only a secular country, but also a country with a nomadic tradition. What does it mean? It means that women were left in the settlement, in the yurt, in the family, alone with the children, with cattle, when men were traveling with cattle for pastures and whatnot. So it's a different tradition, different behavioral pattern than in societies that come from a settled and urban culture, for example, in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan that we mentioned, etc. My guess is going to be that this legislative and legal tendency of recognizing both women's rights and fighting against abuse in the families will continue. Finally, I would say that based on what I learned, it is not only a political or solely a legal issue, it's an all society effort. It is the leadership of President Tokayev, it's the education and practice of the courts, and it's the civil society. It's NGOs, it's a media, it's like grassroots effort to recognize this issue and get rid of it on the societal level, which would be a great step forward for Kazakhstan in terms of its modernization, urbanization, and general success as a society. Thank you very much.
I have a question about the nature of the trial itself and the fact that this was such a transformative event that was brought on by the trial. So from an American perspective, there are these trials that live on in the public consciousness. Brown v. Board, I could name 100 others, and it has changed how civil society and state institutions operate in reference to this trial. And I was wondering if the panelists, but especially Dr. Cohen and Ambassador Jarbusinova, could say more about how the fact that this was a trial that sparked so much change has impacted what the change has been, what civil society is doing, and if there's anything else that I'm leaving out, I'd love to hear it. So thank you again very much.
I think that Wesley Hill, who works with me at the International Tax and Investment Center, is absolutely right. This was a high-profile court. And I think Kazakhstan was not accustomed until now to something like that. I think it's also important to highlight the value or the position the judiciary branch now has in Kazakhstan. Because before, the country traditionally, and this goes back to the Soviet and even Russian imperial times, it's the executive that dominated everything. So it was almost like a pyramid of branches. It's not separation of power in sort of Western sense before that. So the role of the court was highlighted by these proceedings. But also, this is Astana. The court was in Astana, not in Almaty, right? This is Astana. This is the beau monde, the high society in a way. If it happened in Pavlodar Oblast, if it happened in Turkestan or Shymkent, it wouldn't be so high profile. But it also sends a signal that these types of cases are a priority. They can be adjudicated on merits. The начальство, the higher ups, cannot sweep everything under the rug. And that is very important. And I really hope I'm right that it is a watershed event, not just in terms of visibility in social media, but in terms of practice of the law and protection of women.
The reaction in Russia, including, of course, Ksenia Sobchak. I was curious if we might expect a more overt or stronger reaction from Putin himself. Of course, any strong reaction from Putin in regards to Kazakhstan sort of troubles Kazakhstan and Russia's current somewhat ambiguous relationships, especially during in context of the war in Ukraine. And I was curious if anyone had any thoughts regarding Putin's potential reaction.
the neighborhood for Kazakhstan and the fact that it's landlocked creates a lot of challenges. So you have Russia to the north with one of the longest borders in the world. You have China, which is increasingly becoming the leading investor in Kazakhstan. You have more Islamic countries to the south, while the post-Soviet republics remain secular, at least in theory. For the south, you have Afghanistan with the Taliban. You have Iran that I mentioned before. You have extremist madrasas in Pakistan and a large political representation of Islamists in the south. So it's a very, very tough neighborhood. And it takes leaders like former President Nazarbayev and current President Tokayev. Tokayev, as you know, was foreign minister twice and prime minister, people with a lot of experience. President Tokayev was also a senior UN official. It takes skills, highest level of diplomacy, to navigate between China, Russia, and at the same time to keep good relations with the West. And in view of that, recriminalization of family violence when Russia goes into demodernization direction by decriminalizing violence in the family, by having a very prominent role for the Orthodox Church that is melding. There's a mind meld between the state and the church in Russia, by being vehemently and loudly anti-gay. I think Kazakhstan is sending a signal here. And as I said in the beginning of my presentation, I think the vector in Kazakhstan still is towards modernization, towards more, not less, integration into the world, and recognizing that this generation, the modern generation of younger, more educated Kazakhs, are not buying this horrible stuff of beating women and children up. And this is actually makes good politics inside Kazakhstan, and Russia will deal with it. I think the threats from Russia are on a different level. They're on the level of militaristic, imperialistic policy in the neighborhood. And I hope Kazakhstan manages to navigate these stormy waters with full sovereignty and territorial integrity going into the future.